Welcome. I'm Eriko Sato. I'm the coordinator of the MIC's Distinguished Lecture Series. Thank you for joining us for today's special lecture. The MIC, or the Center for Multilingual and Intercultural Communication, was founded in 2014 by Director Agnes Hu, who is a professor of applied linguistics. The MIC provides a creative and collaborative platform for scholars and students to explore the complex and dynamic nature of communication, involving participants from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. MIC's Distinguished Lecture Series brings to Stony Brook cutting-edge research that addresses today's important and urgent questions arising from globalization. Before introducing today's lecturer, I want to acknowledge the help provided by Chikako Nakamura, the assistant to the director, and the intern student Brian Tavares. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies. I also want to let you know that we would have a question and answer session after the lecture. So please put your questions into the chat box in Zoom. And one of the interns is checking the chat box, and I'll be watching it. Please use the default mode, which is to everyone, not just to me or not just to Chicago, but to everyone, so that we can make sure that we can see your questions. Today, we are extremely privileged to have Dr. Ryuko Kubota, professor in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia, where she teaches applied linguistics and teacher education. Dr. Kubota earned her BA in linguistics from Rikkyo University in Tokyo, MAT degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages from School of International Training in Vermont, and her PhD in second language education from University of Toronto. Before joining University of British Columbia in 2009, she was a professor in School of Education and the Department of Asian Studies at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Kubota's research draws on critical approaches to second language education, focusing on race, gender, culture, and language ideologies. She has an extensive publication record. Her research appears in internationally well-recognized scholarly journals such as Applied Linguistics, Critical Inquiry in Language Studies, Foreign Language Annals, Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development, Journal of Second Language Writing, TESOL Quarterly, and World Englishes. She co-edited the book Race, Culture, and Identities in Second Language Education, Exploring Critically Engaged Practice, published by Routledge in 2009, which is an important book for all who studies issues of race in second language education. Dr. Kubota recently received Distinguished Scholarship and Service Award by American Association for Applied Linguistics, which is known AAL. Biases often implicitly yet profoundly exist in educational contexts. I was not very conscious about it when I started to teach Japanese 20 years ago, but I remember that I was alerted by Dr. Kubota's research paper published in 2003 on critical teaching of Japanese culture. Many language teachers in the United States adopt the 5 goals of ACT-FOR's National Standards for Foreign Language Learning, currently called World Readiness Standards for Learning Languages. One of the 5 goals is to teach the culture of the target language. However, as the language teachers try to teach the target culture, they often subconsciously overgeneralize it or stereotype it. While any given culture could be very diverse and constantly changing, this was only one of the many dangers that Dr. Kubota warned language teachers about in her paper a long time ago. Issues of equality, diversity, and social justice are currently urgent topics. So this semester, the MIC members have been actively conducting multiple studies of race in educational contexts. We are extremely privileged to have Dr. Ryuko Kubota with us today. The title of her lecture is Critical Approaches to Social Justice and Anti-Racism in Language Education.
Thank you very much for inviting Professor Sato, Professor He. I'm very privileged to join you. First of all, I would like to make a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that I'm on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I'm very privileged to be here to join you in a very important conversation, and I wish I were there at Stony Brook University. The situation does not allow me to travel, but I hope that I can get some insight from you and share some ideas and information. So I decided to address issues of social justice and anti-racism in general. So I am not going to talk too much about language education. And of course, there's no single correct answer. So this is just an attempt to explore some different ideas. So here's my outline today. So I'm going to share with you 2 episodes from my lived experiences. And then I'm going to talk about social justice and the notion of justice. And then I will switch gears to talk about racism, including different forms of racism, intersectionality, and Operation Olympics, and then critical scrutiny of our own values and building solidarity and conclusion. So this is our plan today. Social justice has become a buzzword in higher education in North America, along with equity, diversity, and inclusion. Here in Canada, we have different diversity politics with an official multicultural policy at the federal level. And actually, multiculturalism creates a kind of national ethos. So Canadians are more accepting and respectful than Americans, many people think. And this multicultural policy has created certain institutional policies and politics. So for example, our university doesn't officially collect data on racial background of faculty and staff. University staff once explained to me that they don't collect data since doing so would be controversial. And I now trying to find out if there's any legal obligation on the part of the university behind this policy. And also some people say that there's no racism in Canada. But is that true? Let's look at the example of how social justice appears in institutional discourse, right? So this is a mission statement of our department. So this is the mission statement of our department. And it says the Department of Language and Literacy Education is a community of educators committed to social justice in scholarship, teaching, and service, blah, blah, blah. And so we see language and literacy as activities that make consensus possible, but it may also lead to inequity and injustice. So we do talk about social justice and social inequity and injustice, but what do we mean by social justice here? So in our department, we have been conducting anti-racist caucus meeting, and we were actually encouraged by Professor Manka Varghese, who came from University of Washington, to give a talk to us about her and her colleagues' experience of advancing anti-racism by using race-based caucuses discussion for teacher candidates. So this provides a safe space for self-identified white students and self-identified students of color to discuss issues of race and racism in separate spaces. In our case, we have been inviting everyone, including faculty, staff, and students, and we divide people into white group and people of color group. In the last meeting, about 3 weeks ago, we basically discussed the meaning of social justice, including equity, diversity, and inclusion in relation to hiring new faculty members. So in my BIPOC, which is Black Indigenous People of Color Caucus group, there were about 10 people, including graduate students and my colleagues, although there were no Black or Indigenous members on that particular day. Our discussion was quite engaging. One graduate student said, My supervisor has lots of experience of working with diverse international students, which makes me comfortable. This was a passing comment. To me, it raises an important point and many questions. So after the meeting, I thought about these questions. Would supervising many international students or traveling to many countries make us someone committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion? Would conducting research on marginalized populations automatically make us advocates of social justice? Here, marginalized populations include immigrants, refugees, speakers of English as an additional language, indigenous people, LGBTQ plus people, homeless people, people with disabilities, and so forth. And does social justice mean treating all people equally? But during our discussion, another participant said, instructors should be aware of their power and authority that can negatively affect students through their control. This was questioned by another participant who said, but instructors are maybe oppressed by students as well because of their marginalized status in terms of race, gender, language, and sexual orientation. So we can see two dramatically different orientations. One, a liberal view on social justice that focuses on diversity, and two, power-aware view. I will come back to this point later. So a few years ago, I gave guest talk on epistemological racism in my colleague's class, which was a required first-year doctoral seminar in my department. In the following semester, I was the instructor of the second required course for the same cohort of doctoral students. Before that semester opened, one female student wanted to drop the course and take a substitute in another department instead. So I cannot share with you the details because they're confidential, but basically she explained to her supervisor that I speak very softly and I have a heavy accent. That's why she wanted to drop my course. And remember, she was in my presentation I gave during the previous semester, and that was the only contact that I had with her. There was another student in the same cohort. She emailed me before the semester opened and asked for my syllabus. So after exchanging several emails, she wrote to me, I can help you improve your syllabus. I said I felt hurt. In fact, I felt very insulted. She didn't register for my class, so she dropped my course as well. What was really troubling to me was the fact that these two women were native speakers of English, but marginalized. So one was indigenous student and the other one was a person of color. These incidents brought back my memories of my pain at UNC Chapel Hill as a non-native English-speaking East Asian female professor, where I worked for about 14 years. So this is what it looks like, UNC Chapel Hill. I often felt I was made invisible and denigrated. So working in the US South with the black-white binary racial politics, Asians were often excluded from the discussion of diversity. Some of my white colleagues, white administrator, and white students microaggressed against me. Now, moving to Vancouver, Canada, I find myself being surrounded by many people who looked like me. And yet, there's a deep-rooted anti-Asian racism, which actually became quite apparent during the outbreak of coronavirus earlier this year. So I will share with you another episode that was quite hurtful. So it goes back to last year, 2019, our Faculty of Education established a task force to address issues of anti-Indigenous racism and racism in general, based on the recommendations from external reviewers of our teacher education program. I made a significant effort toward the formation of the task force, which was eventually established by the dean, but I did not participate in the task force as a member due to my heavy workload. 2020, shortly after the coronavirus outbreak, the task force was suspended because of the increased workload of the leaders. And this was the time when anti-Asian racism began to surface, as you remember. The suspension of the task force meant that nobody was working on this problem. So I volunteered with a couple of my colleagues. One was white ally and the other one was indigenous ally, to draft statements against anti-Asian racism for the university and the Faculty of Education websites. Then, at the end of May, the murder of George Floyd reignited the Black Lives Matter movement. Then, suddenly, the task force was resumed. Let's turn to the concept of social justice. So social justice is a concept that emerged during the European Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century. The term was used by social reformers who wanted to draw ruling classes' attention to uprooted peasants who moved to the urban areas and became workers or dispossessed. Social justice arose from Western vision of establishing social and economic equality among people of color. It refers to the principle of the egalitarian society that is based on the principle of equality and solidarity, that understands and values human rights, and that recognizes the dignity of every human being. So this definition sounds straightforward, but our everyday experience poses many questions like, what is the difference between equality and equity? Whose dignity and rights need greater protection under limited resources? How can we forge solidarity among people who are positioned differently in a power hierarchy? So these questions can be explored by examining the notion of justice. The political philosopher John Rawls conceptualized justice as fairness as manifested in idealized social institutions firmly founded on the position with no bias, prejudice, or partiality. So justice was viewed as a universal system of value within the sovereign state or social institution. So this is a transcendental view of justice, and it was understood as social contract approach. In contrast, the economics philosopher Amartya Sen promoted a comparative or social choice approach to justice, which doesn't seek ideal institution with universal values and justice, but rather constantly scrutinizes our own values based on critical comparisons of values and judgments. So Sen further argues that justice is not just about values and laws within a social institution, but it's about the lives of people who can actually lead by preventing harmful consequences such as poverty, terror, war, displacement, and so forth. And this approach does not assume any predetermined choices for justice, but rather it allows multiple judgments and reasonings in a specific context, location, or culture. It also scrutinizes the relationship of different values, judgments, and choices that may collide, contradict, or reinforce each other. So to illustrate this, Sen presented an example of 3 children fighting to claim ownership of a flute. I'm quoting him. Anne claims the flute on the ground that she is the only one of the 3 who knows how to play it. Bob defends his case by pointing out that he is the only one among the 3 who is so poor that he has no toys on his own. So Carla points out that she has been working diligently for many months to make the flute with her own labor. So this example shows all these positions have convincing justifications, and it's very difficult to make a single choice. The impossibility of arriving at a single universal choice is at the heart of the comparative view of justice. Now, let's go back to my episode. So I introduced student view that social justice, or the value of equity, diversity, and inclusion, is about working with diverse international students. Related questions include whether social justice is about conducting research on minoritized population or treating everybody equally. But as I mentioned, these views are contrasted with the other views on the dual working of power between professors and students. So what seems important is to pay attention to power and power relations that influence justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. This corresponds to different approaches to multiculturalism. Since the 1990s, educators in the United States have discussed the difference between liberal multiculturalism and critical multiculturalism. Liberal multiculturalism is reflected in appreciating diversity among international students and treating everyone with respect and equality. It's a superficial approach to celebrating difference. Paradoxically, it also tends to emphasize human sameness. For example, a teacher might say, you have to treat all kids the same, white, black, red, purple. You can't have different rules for different kids. As you see, this falls into colorblind or difference-blind discourse. Another example here is hiring a new faculty member in higher education. My colleague Annette Henry, in her forthcoming article, talks about how a Latina candidate who was invited for a campus interview requested the search committee chair if she could meet Latinx faculty members across the campus during her campus visit for job interview. The chair said no, because none of the other candidates who were not Latinx met with Latinx faculty. But it's absolutely natural for candidates of color to want to learn about the campus climate, and this information can be crucial for their decision making. In contrast, critical multiculturalism places power and power relations at the core. So it confronts issues of racism and other oppressions. It questions the liberal approach because, for example, having visited many countries or having many international friends or Black friends or doing research on marginalized populations do not automatically lead to critical understanding of difference. So for instance, Ilan Kapoor in Critical Developmental Studies discusses participatory development, PD, which is an approach to developmental projects in third world countries by focusing on bottom-up participation of the local people for empowerment for the project, in the project. So the intention is to move away from neo-colonial ideology based on Eurocentric values. And it sounds like a well-intentioned effort of decolonization, but Kapoor argues that it can fall into self-congratulatory benevolence and self-righteousness and benefits the researcher more than the local people. He talks about the researcher strategy of self-effacement in giving power to the local facilitator in the meetings and projects and so forth. And he states, pretending to step down from the power and privilege, even as one exercises them as master of ceremony, is a reinforcement, not a diminishment of such power and privilege. Humility, patience, respect, etc. may be the public expression of PD's guilty conscience. I'm a bit ashamed of being in charge of your empowerment. And isn't it nice of me to acknowledge it? But these may also be acts of self-glorification and gratification. It doesn't really matter whether or not people are empowered as long as I come off looking good. This results in both cases the result in both cases is that PD centers not only on the other, but on the I. So there's no easy solution to address this problem. As Kapoor states, PD is not bad, but it's dangerous. So we need to always critically reflect on the actual and potential consequences of what we do in teaching and research and live in the reflexivity of discomfort, as Wanda Pillow argues. Let's look at the second episode that I shared with you. It was about two PhD students not taking the required course that I was going to teach. So what made me disturbed was the fact that I was rejected by minoritized women. The story also demonstrates how power can work in complex ways. In this case, my language, race, and maybe gender intersected, and I was perhaps seen inferior to these students. I'm not sure if this was mainly a case of racism or linguicism or linguistic discrimination, but perhaps race was a major factor. So let's take a look at the notion of race. So we need to understand racism that functions in different forms. So racism usually evokes individual racism or racial microaggressions, which is defined as everyday intentional or unintentional racial insult. But what affects us even more is institutional racism, or racism in our social structures, in employment, healthcare, housing, criminal justice, entertainment, and so on. So recent Black Lives Matter movement has illuminated the structural problem that perpetuate police violence, the mass incarceration of Black people. I mentioned the example of Latina job candidates who was not allowed to meet other Latino faculty because of equal treatment of all candidates. This will only perpetuate systemic racism. Moreover, what's often overlooked is epistemological racism that impacts our knowledge production, distribution, and consumption. For instance, white Euro-American cultural perspectives tend to predominate the curriculum and textbook over non-white histories or ways of knowing in schools. Another example might be Columbus Day. In the United States, 13 states now observe it as Indigenous Peoples Day. So this is a reversal of historical perspectives. I don't know about New York State. Also, it's important to note that all these three forms of racism influence each other and shape our experiences. Another important notion related to racism is intersectionality. In my second episode, a student perceived my heavy accent. Would she react the same way if I was a white instructor with an East European accent? What if I were a man, white man? There are so many factors behind the scenes which I cannot disclose, but it seems that in this case, language intersected with race, gender, and maybe other identity categories in a complex way. The notion of intersectionality discussed by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black female legal scholar, explains the multidimensionality of Black women's experiences of marginality and vulnerability that cannot be understood or explained by singling out race or gender as a separate identity category. So scholars, especially Black women, have argued that a single dimensional or single act approach using either race or gender as the analytic category is not sufficient to understand the oppression against Black women, which is not equivalent to what is experienced by white women or Black men. Crenshaw concludes that because of the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated. However, scholars point out the problem of so-called additive or multiple approach. So here, multiple identity categories such as race, gender, class are simply added to explain Black women's experience. The problem is a potential essentialization of these categories as seen as unitary and static. For example, the view that all Black women have identical experience regardless of a location or context. So the issue of essentialism is also reflected in the politics of theory of intersectionality itself. So intersectionality as a theory has actually traveled across the disciplines and geographical locations. So the original intention of the concept was to promote social justice for Black women, but the meaning has been stretched and altered. So this stretch is reflected, for example, in a proposal to be all-inclusive, including maleness, whiteness, and heterosexuality. Or the stretch is seen in the appropriation of the concept by European feminists who actually excluded race from their discussion. So these appropriations have created a sense of displacement of Black women as central subject of the theory of intersectionality. However, Nash problematizes intersectionality as identity politics that essentializes Black women as the most oppressed group. So here, we also see the problem of oppression Olympics. So oppression Olympics can be defined as groups compare for the mantle of most oppressed to gain the attention and political support of dominant groups as they pursue political remedies, leaving the overall system of stratification unchanged. Or it can be defined as intergroup competition and victimhood, according to Angie Marie Hancock. The second episode that I shared with you hints at my dilemma of reconciling the feeling of being discriminated against as a non-native English-speaking East Asian woman and the acknowledgement of my own privilege as a professor compared to the minoritized female students. So here, intersectionality and power relations make it impossible to answer the question of who is more oppressed, me or the students? Also, I shared with you a story about the task force, which was suspended during the anti-Asian racism and resumed in the wake of Black Lives Matter movement. To me, this implicitly conveys the idea of which group is more worth saving than others. In fact, oppression hierarchy is supported by statistical data about healthcare, income, poverty rates, incarceration rates, access to education, educational attainment, and more. And you see clear stratification of different racialized groups proven by statistical data. I'm also aware that I'm a settler of color in Canada who benefit from the colonial system that has caused displacement and continuing oppression of Indigenous people. This awareness requires us to decolonize anti-racism. The discourse of Oppression Olympics influences my self-consciousness. We middle-class East Asian women are minoritized settlers of color, and yet we're privileged moral minorities vis-a-vis Indigenous people, Black people, and dark-skinned people, or even white working-class people. And thus, we should recognize our privilege and think accordingly. Nonetheless, as an East Asian woman faculty member in my institution and in a broader field, I have often felt denigrated, alienated, and made invisible. So racism, marginalization, and invisibility faced by Asian women scholars are real, making me want to say anti-Asian racism does exist and affects us in immediate ways. We're no better off than Black or Indigenous colleagues. However, by thinking in this way, I'm participating in Oppression Olympics. So in discussing social justice, I showed an example of 3 women fighting over food. We can alter the story to see how the Oppression Olympics may work in racial terms. So imagine there were more children in poverty, like Bob. They all wanted the flute, and all of them were children of color, but poor. right? Black, Indigenous, Latinx, East Asian, South Asian, Arab, and so forth. What rationale would you use to justify the choice? Again, we can point out which group is more marginalized by drawing on the statistics. People who belong to a certain racialized group may be socially better off, even in poverty, compared to others. When the children are fighting over one flute, then the question becomes who's more oppressed and thus more deserving than others. Some of you may say, well, the fundamental problem is that there's only one flute. Then let's give all children a flute. But then when it comes to a flute contest, then who will be likely to become a winner? Obviously, a child from a family that has a space to practice in their house, or who has access to private flute lessons. So then we are hitting against a wall of socioeconomic inequalities. So the same applies to giving a laptop to every child for equity under the current situation. So we can see how difficult it is to achieve social justice, equity, and inclusion for everyone, on top of the contentious question of who deserves the most recognition. Ultimately, the Oppression Olympics would perpetuate the system of oppression, forcing oppressed groups to want to compete each other when we should be collaborating each other in order to eradicate the system of oppression. So it's very important for us to know that Oppression Olympics maintain the white dominant structure. As Alcoff states, keeping us in conflict with each other and not in coalition is in the interests of the current power structure. So in the Oppression Olympics, different judgments or opinions compete each other on who is more entitled to justice. In order to avoid falling into this game, it's necessary for us to step outside of the competition arena. In scrutinizing judgments for justice, Amartya Sen suggests that we try to examine different values that others have in objective manners so that we can critically understand our own. So he states attempts at being objective can be helped by our putting on other people's hats, even their identities, and asking ourselves how their choices, our values, look to them. So in exercising social justice for well-being of all humans, what is crucial is this willingness to be critical about even what seems just and ethical for us. So this is certainly not easy, but critical scrutiny of our own context, others' positions, and self-reflexivity are essential for exploring genuine justice. So finally, as a language education specialist, I would like to conclude my talk by addressing how the issues I have presented are relevant to language studies, just very briefly. So related to the second episode, marginalization and discrimination against non-native English speakers or non-native language speakers have long been discussed in our field. Recent research on racial linguistic biases and reverse linguistic stereotypes have shed light on the intersectionality of language and race. So we must continue to address these injustices. At the same time, we need to be cautious of simplistic analysis of relations between native English speakers and non-native English speakers, since other identity categories such as race, gender, sexuality, ability, nationality, institutional status, and so on, as well as settler colonialism, intersect each other to form complicated power dynamics. Interrogating racial linguistic injustices should be founded on the principle of intersectionality and allyship that stands against the Oppression Olympics. And we must exercise collective agency to pursue common purpose for challenging oppression in broader terms, such as white supremacy, capitalist self-interest, colorblindness, and patriarchy. This perspective invites us to be aware of power dynamics, privilege, even in marginality, and the critical reflexivity of our own power. This critical reflexivity is essential for promoting social justice and anti-racism. And this concludes my talk, and here are some selected references. And thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at this address. So thank you very much for listening.
I didn't see anything on the chat. People were really busy listening
Okay.
to your lecture, and it was really rich in content and very we had a very much great learning experience. So I'd like to open the floor. So if you have questions, could you just unmute yourself and then start talking? I think that would be easier for the audience.
Thank you for a great talk, Ryuko. Really enjoyed that. I just had a quick question, if you don't mind. I just jumped in first following your advice. You used the example of the task force, and I felt like it wasn't really resolved, because were you trying to then, based on what you outlined for us, to say that that was an example of the oppression Olympics and you shouldn't have felt bad? Or, I mean, it seems to me that the university itself is creating these hierarchies of oppression, right?
Yes, yes,
And
yeah.
therefore, I mean, as people who are not Black, not Indigenous, we also can be targets of brutal racism. The history of this country and of what's going on currently also shows us that. So, I mean, I'm just wondering how that example relates to what you laid out and what you think should be the appropriate response, because I feel like, you've put those things on the table, which is really important, which is that there are right now, there's a big view on, and rightfully so, on anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And yet at the same time, that doesn't mitigate the fact that there are other ongoing forms of racism, and how are those being addressed or not addressed? So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks, Ryuko.
Yeah, thank you, Eve. I think it was a very bad example of institutional handling of different forms of racism. It sort of created Oppression Olympics in our own mind, and maybe it created anger among some of us, or maybe guilt feeling, because we do have this very emotional, very complex feelings about what to make of different forms of racism, right? And all the issues of privilege and all these issues. So I think it's very complex, but in this particular example is a really bad handling at the level of administration, that they suspended this task force. And I did complain, but I haven't received any apology, and I will keep pushing.
I have a question. I thought you made a fantastic, and the last person who asked a question, I thought that was a fantastic point about how there are so many things that kind of escape this hierarchy that we have of oppression in so many circumstances. Especially, I'm Jewish, and in my own community, I actually was dealing with this during your talk. I was distracted by some anti-Semitic comments that were being made on Facebook, especially in a university environment, and especially in a context of, being among a more, I feel like people with liberal leanings are more apt to perceive racial inequalities, but at the same time, we also fall prey to not being able to be as self-critical, because we kind of might see ourselves as the torchbearers of addressing these racial inequalities. So what are some good ways of, in practice, deconstructing this hierarchy? Because there are lots of ways where my community faces really bad prejudice, but it's kind of dismissed, because to the concept of the masses, oh, Jews are white passing. And certainly many of us do reap the benefits of white privilege, but it just doesn't fit for them. in the hierarchy of things, and it's kind of static. So what are some ways we can kind of break that down? Because when I'm there vouching for my community and trying to impart explanation and trying to evoke examples, it's difficult because there aren't many other, I mean, there are Yazidis and there are other ethno-religious groups, but not in a context where you can, implore relatability.
So I think, again, I think the recognition of both marginality and privilege, right? I mean, many people do carry that dual identity. And I think it's very important. I mean, it's easy to really focus on, illuminate on marginality because we are the victim and we speak about that, but then it's more difficult to recognize privilege. I think focusing on that is very, very important. And to become aware of our own privilege, we have to really exercise critical reflexivity and sort of letting go of our attachment to marginality, maybe, right? I don't know the one single answer to your question, and I think we just need to continue to explore some ways of letting go of our marginality and recognize our privilege. It's very difficult, and we usually fall into sort of victimization, victim discourse. It's very easy for us to see ourselves as victims. So how do we go beyond that? How do we see our relationship with others? It's very difficult. Or even a privileged person, it's very difficult to recognize a privilege. Even though superficially we say, yeah, I do understand and so forth, it's very difficult, I think, to recognize the difference between superficially recognizing and deeply recognizing. I don't know. I don't have the answer, and I have seen people, I have been observing, people, how to deal with this. And I wish I had an answer, but I think we need to continue to explore.
Thank you. Loredana, you had a question, right?
You've seen me hovering there. Yeah, I would like to jump in there. It was a fantastic talk, and I really I found it so stimulating. And I wanted to stay for a moment on the question of intersectionality, thinking also about the two questions we've had so far, because it seems to me that one interesting issue is that if we think intersectionally, we don't necessarily always occupy the same position. So we ourselves may think of ourselves as belonging to different communities, to different groups. We may identify and self-identify in different ways at different points. And so I think, so my question to you is, can intersectionality help us to think about that multiple positionality, about the dynamic rather than the static way in which we can deal or try to deal with these issues, and does that help us on the Olympics problem? The other side for me is to do specifically with language. I have found in my own work, in my experience, that so both the work and the personal experience, that often language works as a proxy. So when it is not possible, when it is not acceptable, when it is difficult to talk about race, when, for instance, someone knows that they would be perceived as racist, talking about language can become a way of shifting discourse on what seems to be safer ground. But effectively, what we're talking about is still racism, while language stands in for something else, whether it's the color of your skin or whether, well, racism or other forms of discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with you on the second point. Language and sometimes culture, the function as a proxy of race, right? Yeah, it's interesting that race and gender becomes, in the context of discrimination, is really a bad thing. It has the social stigma for racism and sexism. But linguicism, I think people sort of take it for granted, and for many people, it's okay to make fun of, accented English or, accented whatever language, right? I'm just trying to see how we can address that problem, right? I mean, linguistic discrimination is huge and, it's unjust, but it's not seen as, discrimination or even violation of human rights, So I think we need to do some work, maybe public scholarship, to make people aware that linguistic discrimination is really, damaging. The other point about multiple identities and intersectionality, I guess it's related. We do have different identities and we do make a choice of our own identity, which group to join and so forth, right? I guess in the sense that we are people with multiple identity has to do with intersectionality, but then to some extent it's different because the multiple identity is more about individual person, individual identity, whereas intersectionality can have some implications of social movement and social issues. For example, Black women movement and raising the status of certain group, right? It seems it's more political than individual choice of multiple identity.
Agnes, you have a question? Agnes?
Hello, Ryuko. This is fascinating, fantastic talk. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I say that from bottom of my heart. I think for someone like you, who is seen as so accomplished, well-celebrated scholar who has just received the most prestigious award from AAAL as the annual Distinguished Scholarship and Service Award, to come and say that you have personally experienced marginalization, discrimination. This is very powerful. Thank you for putting that in the open, on the table for us to see and to discuss and to reckon with. Thank you so much. This is so important. I also identify with the point that you made, which is that in the too often Black and white discourse on racism and discrimination, anyone who's not white, not Black gets lost in that discussion. And I want to thank you also for highlighting this important missing piece. That said, I do have some questions. So feel free. I mean, if you don't want to comment, that's fine too. So, and that these questions come from me as someone who, as you know, I do work on discourse and communication and conversation. As I was listening to you, we're talking about, for example, who is more oppressed. We're talking about the power and power relations as the core. Now, is this, this actually relates to what Loredana just said about language. Language is a proxy, right? The language, the linguistic, verbal, discursive manifestation of it. So we cannot really psychologize about people. We cannot go inside people's head or their mind to figure out exactly what they think, how they feel. The only thing that we do have that I can look at and that you can look at and everybody else can look at would be, from my perspective, would be. So in that sense, then, are we talking about somebody's communicative projection, or are we talking about the recipient's perception of what is being said? I mean, this gets into I don't want to dilute the political aspect, but I think there is a communicative discourse aspect to it that perhaps that I, for myself, would need to be clarified in order for these notions to be operationalizable. So I'll pause here for you to comment.
Oh, okay, yeah. I mentioned reverse linguistic stereotypes, and I don't know if you're familiar with that research, but kind of similar to the discussion on racial linguistic ideologies, right? Even though a person is, speaking in clear accent, because of the race of the speaker, the speech is perceived as accented, right? So the perception part is really, important in the sense that I guess it's co-constructed, but then the perception really creates the meaning of that output, right? Linguistic stereotype is the phenomenon where the language, the linguistic information triggers the perception of the speaker's, characteristics. So, for example, if you listen to, Black English, sort of automatically, evokes the image of Black person, right? Yeah, but a reverse linguistic stereotype is that phenomenon where the non-linguistic stimuli, for example, racial characteristic of the speaker, would influence the perception of the speech, right? So, classic experiment is, Donald Rubin's, right? The two classrooms and, one classroom for the audience. One classroom, they show the picture of Asian instructor, female instructor, and the other classroom, they show the picture of white female instructor. And then the students listen to the exact same recorded lecture. And then later, they ask the students to do the listening comprehension test and also speech recognition, like, accent and things. And the people who looked at the white female instructor scored better in listening comprehension and then heard less accent. Actually, the recording was done by native speaker of English. So I think this is a really clear example of how the visual or non-linguistic information influences the way people perceive the speech.
One question says, I wonder if you could mention ways to address injustices in the classroom. Could you give a few examples?
I think I think this whole thing is more about our disposition or our approach rather than sort of, okay, so I'm going to have a class on racism. Well, I sometimes do in my graduate course, but, for a language class, I think it's more of, overarching philosophy, and it needs to pervade throughout the curriculum in order to address injustices, right? So I don't know which class we're talking about, but if it's a language classroom, then we always need to be aware of issues of race, gender, class, age, all these nationality, sexuality, and, all these things. We need to be aware of who is included, who's marginalized, and so forth, right? And sometimes these issues come up even though you were not really prepared. Some racist comment may come up, or some incident come up in your classroom. And I think it's very contextual, and there's no single, approach to do this. But I think we need to be prepared for that, and we make appropriate judgment how to deal with it. I have written some time ago, I don't remember if I shared it with you, but a paper on controversial issues in the classroom. So
thank you. So this was a question from the audience. MIC is working hard to talk about race and then how it relates to education. There are some racism that come from hate, but sometimes they may come from ignorance. So looks like education context could be the source or could be the solution for racism. The fact that you mentioned that language-based racism is very hard to combat. It was very useful for us to understand how complex it is. It is not simple at all. So that was your talk was really wonderful and made us think very deeply.
I know we have more questions, but we do have Professor Kubota's contact information. So I would encourage those people who, if your questions are not addressed, please feel free to contact our distinguished speaker by email. I would like to thank Ryuko for coming again virtually to Stony Brook University. And I would like also to thank all the participating audience. We had a large turnout today. And then we have recorded the talk, and if you give us permission, we will be proud to put it on our website, our center website, so that it can benefit a wider audience. With that, thank you. And we can all unmute ourselves and give Ryuko a big round of clap.